Good afternoon. My name is Abby Edens, Director of Education at the National World War II Museum, and I want to welcome you to our Lunchbox Lecture program. This program is made possible by our sponsor, AARP Louisiana. Our presenter today is Dr. Marcus Cox from Xavier University, who, in a talk entitled World War II Military Service as Civil Rights Activism, will discuss how military service during World War II and racial integration in the armed forces heightened expectations for social progress and led to the quest for civil and equal rights. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Marcus Cox.
Thank you, Abby. And thank you, everyone, for being here for this lecture on military service as civil rights activism. I appreciate the opportunity and certainly appreciate the National World War II Museum. I want to start off first and talk about a little bit about myself and how I came to this particular topic. I'm originally from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and while I was a professor at Southern University in Baton Rouge, I had an opportunity to get my PhD or study at Northwestern University in Evanston. And as a new history student, I was trying to figure out a topic that would allow me to learn more about my personal interests, but also make a contribution to how individuals learn more about African American history in particular. I come from a military family. My grandfather, Matthew Trahan, who was originally from Rayne, Louisiana, here in Louisiana, and he served in the U.S. Army for 30 years, excuse me. He enrolled or was inducted in 1941, and he retired in the Army in 1972. He was the biggest influence in my life, and he's what I would call a real military man. Even well after he retired, he would get up early in the morning time. He would polish his shoes. The military lifestyle was so ingrained in him, and he was such a proud individual when it came to his service. So growing up, of course, you know, in living in the South, I always knew that there was a real strong contradiction between military service and first-class citizenship. And I often wondered why African Americans would fight for a country that didn't support them or even treat them fairly. And so at different occasions when I had an opportunity to talk to different individuals who had served during World War II and also Korea and even Vietnam, I would always ask, why would they join the military? In many cases, people would tell me that either they joined or they didn't join, they were drafted, or they didn't want to go, or they did want to go. So I never really got any real clear answers. But I also knew that military service was had a very positive impact on my family. My grandfather had an opportunity to travel around the world. He put his brothers and sisters through college, and he paid for it. My mother was able to get a master's degree, and he came from a family that did not have a lot of education. So I saw a lot of the positive benefits of military service, but I didn't really understand why African Americans would fight for the right to fight. So I decided to focus on that topic for my dissertation when I was at Northwestern. The title of my dissertation or subtitle was African American Attitudes Toward Military Service. And I did quite a bit of research, and what I found out was there were three things historically that was closely connected to military service. And that was, number one, citizenship, or rights of citizenship. Number two, definitions of manhood, and the definition of masculinity. That military service was closely connected with that definition. In other words, that's how a young man would leave his family and go off into the military and become a man. And then, more surprisingly, educational opportunities was a feature that I kept seeing as early as the Civil War, but certainly throughout World War II. That many African Americans, many Americans in period, who didn't really know how to read and write very well or had very little education, they joined the military, and while they were there, they enhanced their educational opportunities, whether in the military or when they left the military. And so those are three things that are very, very important as it relates to status, political status here in this country. And then it started to make sense to me why African Americans would fight for the right to fight, because these were the three things that were really that was key to their success after they left the military. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. I want to apologize before I start. I'm going to probably read a lot on the screen because I tried to put a lot of information on these different slides, and I want to make sure that you guys get as much information as possible. But I'll be very happy to elaborate as I go through the slides. So, the history of military service and the politics of citizenship. Militaries are more than war-fighting machines. They are important sites of social and cultural power and contestation. Military institutions and service have long been linked to citizenship and manhood. In times of war, but particularly in times of peace, manpower policies may constitute a strong signal of how the state will respond to minority citizenship claims. And so that's really important because when you look historically at military service and the minority population, whether it's African Americans, whether it's Hispanic Americans, or whether it's even Irish Americans, how they are treated in the military reflects their social status in civilian society, and vice versa. The link between military service and citizenship can be traced back to the republican city-states of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. It was preserved in the medieval European militias and was continually reborn over the centuries. Machiavelli drew on it when he discovered the military discipline, the training ground for the citizen attentive to the common good, and in the willingness and ability to bear arms, the test of individual autonomy. 18th century German philosopher George Hegel saw military service as, and I quote, ultimate expression of the individual's recognition of his membership in ethical community of the state. By the 17th century and 18th centuries, organized militia became the hallmark of social responsibility and reflected full citizenship. So as we're talking about the colonial period in the United States, of course, the issue of citizenship and who has the right to vote was originally associated with land ownership. But as time went on, then it became more associated with those individuals who served in local militia. Because those individuals who served in local militia and put their lives on the line had a stake in the community. And they also had a voice in the community. So by denying African Americans or Native Americans or other Americans the right to serve in the military, what you're essentially doing is you're denying them citizenship rights and a place in society. During the colonial period, African Americans were excluded from militia units because slaves and free blacks were routinely feminized and stereotyped by white Southerners as children and believed to be incapable of manly acts of bravery or valor. As a result, white men denied African American males citizenship rights and the social and political benefits afforded to males in a patriarchal society. And let me just add to this slide for a second. One of the other attributes that was associated with African American males was the sin of being a dependent. And so at that particular time in the colonial period, the individuals that were dependents, women or children, were individuals that did not have a voice in society and certainly was the opposite or the contradiction of being manly. So if you were a slave and you were looked down upon, whether as inferior for whatever reasons, then in many cases your social status was associated with dependency. And so African American men were considered to be dependents, and by that status, they were the opposite of being manly. African Americans came forward in droves for the Union Army in the Civil War, and wrapped their post-war demands in the bloody flag, as Frederick Douglass stated, and I quote, "If the black man knows enough to shoulder a musket and to fight for the flag, fight for the government, he knows enough to vote. Shall we be citizens in war and aliens in peace?" End quote. So again, during the Civil War, and it's many people who might know a little bit about the Civil War, African Americans did not start, joining or being inducted into in the Union Army till after 1863. And they were doing it for many, many reasons. Certainly to fight for the Union, certainly to fight against the institution of slavery, but many individuals were joining because of the benefits of being in the military. And one of the things that I learned through my research was that almost every United States colored troop regiment had a improvised school within that regiment. So there were either missionaries or there were individuals that were teaching former slaves how to read and write within those regiments. The interesting thing about those regiments is that after the war is over, many of those individuals that served in the United States Union Army were individuals that not only became very involved politically throughout the South in their respective state governments, but also those individuals went on to found historically black colleges because they learned how to read and write while they served in the military, and that was another avenue to full citizenship. World War II, a decisive moment in American history. Though the commencement of World War II brought African Americans optimism and hope for a brighter future, most African Americans were guarded in their expectations because of the horrific race riots and violence that occurred after World War I upon the return of African American soldiers from overseas. Jim Crow laws and the daily lynching of black men and women continue to serve as constant reminders of African American subordination and oppression, despite President Roosevelt's impassioned call to arms to fight for the four freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom to worship God, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And this became really, really important during the very beginning of World War II, and also to motivate people, not just African Americans, but all Americans, to serve in the military and fight against oppression, Nazism, fascism in World War II. It was sort of a galvanizing message. But of course, for African Americans and people of color, there was extreme contradiction in this because African Americans could not vote. African Americans lived in constant fear. African Americans certainly did not have the ability to voice their opinions or express their views, certainly in a legal sense. So even though this may have resonated with many people, many African Americans understood that these were sort of, I guess, goals or dreams that African Americans could aspire to. But World War II was different. From previous conflicts, the Great Migration of African Americans to northern and Midwestern cities during the early 20th century reshaped the national political map of the 1930s and encouraged African Americans to demand more from the White House and federal government in return for political support. Now, this is one of the subjects that I used to really enjoy when I taught at the Citadel Military College some years ago. Because normally when I would talk about the civil rights movement and I would talk about what was happening in the United States as it relates to African American political activism, a lot of young people would get the impression that a lot of the civil rights success and the social and political success that African Americans received was by virtue of ethical or moral motivation from the White House or from others. And I used to, explain to them that African Americans during the Great Migration after World War I, millions of African Americans moved to Chicago, New York, Detroit, other places where they really impacted the balance of political power in the local, state, and national elections. And so what this did was it gave African Americans more influence on the state governments, but also the federal government, the national government, because anybody who wanted to be president would have to receive or could receive millions of votes from African Americans. And so you have African American leaders who are asking more of not just the state governments in those particular those particular states in the North, but also the White House. And you see this happens quite often during World War II, which also, I guess, is the reason why you have so many political and social victories for African Americans during World War II. Millions of African Americans that served in the armed forces as second-class citizens is even more incredible given the racial, political, and economic climate that African Americans faced during the 1930s and 40s. Given the circumstances, one would question why a black man or woman would volunteer to serve in a segregated military. And so as I read this statement, I always come back to my own family story in terms of my grandfather. My grandfather graduated from high school. He was working as a carpenter with his father in Rayne, Louisiana, and in 1941 decided to join the military. And of course, like on many Americans, the military had a tremendous and positive impact on him and his family. But I also think about this particular period of time where America's coming out of the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression, or at the height of the Great Depression, the unemployment rate was approximately 25%. 25% of the American labor force was out of work. There was a level of homelessness and despair that America had never seen. And then by 1941, as the war started, the war industry started to gain momentum. You have the arsenal of democracy in terms of factories building planes and ships and needing labor. And you also have African Americans and many Americans who didn't have any employment opportunities can now serve in the U.S. military. And so at this particular time, many Americans are taking advantage of the opportunity. And again, if you ask 10 different people, you might get 10 different answers in terms of why people are doing this, whether for patriotic reasons, whether for personal reasons, or the fact that someone just wants to be able to have an income so they can send money home to their family, like my grandfather did. And so when I think about why would someone want to serve in the military, and especially in a segregated army, that's the reasons that I sort of were able to find out. My personal story is very similar to many other Americans' personal stories. In the North, white supremacy barred African Americans from the idea of the citizen soldier, who had direct influence on American political life in return for his service in the military. White Americans often forgot, or rather intentionally overlooked, blacks. If they were included, it was in a stereotypical representation. Black men were either impotent slave characters or oversexed brutes, both unable to live or perform in a modern society without white control and guidance. And so, of course, at the turn of the century, certainly after World War I, and even during the interwar years, this is sort of the idea of, or what people think about when they think of African Americans. I think two examples of this that really stand out to me is the motion picture, or the early motion picture, The Birth of a Nation in 1915, where it literally characterizes African American males as serial rapists, violent brutes. And these individuals had to be sort of contained, whether violently and physically or in some manner. There's no coincidence at this particular time. You have mass incarceration of African Americans and black codes from the late 19th century in the Jim Crow era that are sending large numbers of African American youth to the penitentiary and the penal system. This was a form of control. I often would tell my students that for African Americans, historically, the criminal justice system was more of a system of control than it was a system of justice. And so this is a perfect example of that. Also in 1925, the Army War College put out a study called the employment of Negro manpower in war. And it was one of the first racial studies of what to do and how to use African Americans during war. And of course, this document that the U.S. military used to formulate policy as it relates to African Americans was very, very racist. And in short, the study, and I quote, referred to Negroes as a subspecies of the human race. And so when you have the federal government, when you have the military that view African Americans as a subspecies of the human race, this is going to have a strong impact on how they're viewed and how also they're treated. And so this is what African Americans, like my grandfather, experienced when he joined in 1941, because these ideas of race were very common and reflective not only in the South, but also in the North. The black press and leaders characterized the hypocrisy of fighting for democracy abroad while denying social equality to blacks and minorities at home. The black press and civil rights leaders announced the launch of the WWII campaign to triumph over the enemies of democracy abroad, as well as over segregation at home. Black soldiers in particular believed that they had earned the right to protest social injustice and racism in America. To white supremacists and segregationists, black soldiers represented everything which blacks should not be: armed and independent men serving the nation. So this was a very disruptive time in America during World War II. And while Americans sort of came together and fought a common enemy, there was a lot of social and racial unrest here in the United States. The old and the new. There we go. When World War II began, 5 of the 5,000 black members of the U.S. Army were officers. I'll say that again. 5 of the 5,000 members of the U.S. Army were officers. World War II for African Americans was a matter of old and new. General Mark Clark's calling the black 92nd Division the worst division in Europe was old racism. Despite their anger at military racism, African Americans were elated by the fact that blacks were going to war in revolutionary new ways. There were black fighter pilots, naval officers, Army WACs, Navy WAVs, which are female personnel, Marines, paratroopers, and armored tank crews. They even won medals of honor in integrated warfare during the Battle of the Bulge. In 1944, the 92nd Infantry's Division Mortar Company wiped out numerous enemy machine gun emplacements during the U.S. Army's Italian campaign. Although implements within the military establishment tried to keep them in a labor support role, African-American combat troops made notable contributions in both the European and Pacific theaters. In June 1942, the U.S. Army began accepting black inductees from the Selective Service Board for the first time. About 167,000 blacks served in the Navy in World War II. 123,000 of these men were served overseas. Almost 12,500 African Americans served in the Seabees, as the Navy's construction battalions were known. The Seabees also received assault training supplemental to their primary duty. In March 1944, the U.S. Navy commissioned 13 African Americans as its first black officers. These men later dubbed themselves the Golden 13, a designation subsequently adopted by the Navy because of their pioneering efforts to integrate the Navy. The Navy commissioned about 60 African Americans during World War II. America's first black Marines saw action in the South Pacific in 1944. Although 75% of the 17,000 new Marines had some college education, none became officers. They had been accepted in 1942 under segregated training conditions at the Black Marine Training Center at Munford Point, North Carolina. only a token two Marine Defense Battalions, the 51st and 52nd, were trained for combat. The majority of black volunteers were trained either as messmen or stewards or non-combat depot and ammunition companies. Black Marine Defense Battalions in the South Pacific saw little action, but non-combat depot and ammunition companies trained only with light weapons fought and suffered casualties in the bloody battles of Saipan, Guam, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima. America's first black armored combat unit, the 761st Tank Battalion, was called Experimental by General George S. Patton. He was happy to have them to reinforce his bogged-down Third Army just before the Battle of the Bulge. The 761st fought nonstop from October 31st, 1944 to May 6, 1945, in 4 major Allied campaigns in 6 European countries. The 761st, whose motto was "Come Out Fighting," spearheaded the American advance through France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland, Germany, and Austria. In the front all the way, they beat the Russians to the Rhine, spending 183 consecutive days on the front line, more than any other armored battalion, and suffered a 50% casualty rate. The Army led the way for black women in military. Approximately 130 black Army nurses and Red Cross women and 1 large black Army Postal Directory battalion of the Women's Army Corps went to England in World War II. The 800 black women of the 68, of course I never get the numbers right, it's 68888, Central Postal Directory Battalion, who arrived in Britain in 1945, were in charge of redirecting all V-mail for Europe. In the mid-20ish, Commander Major Charity Adams was the first black officer in the Women's Army Corps. On the 21st of August, 1944, the Red Ball Express began operations crucial to the defeat of Nazi Germany. This massive supply effort ran until 16 November 1944 and involved over 6,000 trucks and trailers. Red Ball drivers transported 412,000 tons of material to American troops as they advanced through France from Normandy to the German border. About 75% of the drivers of the segregated Red Ball Express were African Americans. The Tuskegee Airmen. As the war in Europe escalated in 1941, the Army Air Corps reported plans to establish an African American pursuit squadron at Tuskegee, and that's in Alabama. The squadron was to consist of 400 enlisted men and 33 pilots. Tuskegee received over $1 million from the War Department to upgrade and expand facilities to accommodate 27 planes. Once the pilots were being trained, the NAACP was able to exert enough pressure on the federal government to have them formally organized into a bombing unit. On May 13, 1943, the Air Corps officially formed the 616th Bombardment Squadron, making it the feeder squadron for the 477th Bomber Squadron. Combat gave the Tuskegee Airmen an opportunity to do more than defeat their enemy. It also gave them a chance to score a hit against prejudice in the U.S. and elsewhere. Perhaps the Tuskegee Airmen's greatest accomplishments occurred on March 24, 1945, when Colonel Benjamin Davis led 43 Red-Tail P-51s into battle to protect B-17 bombers destined for a round-trip mission to Germany. The planes flew more than 1,600 miles that day to bomb German factories in Berlin. And during the mission, the German Air Force came after the bombers. African-American pilots shot down a number of German fighters and protected the bombers successfully. That day, the 99th won its third Distinguished Unit Citation, this time protecting their charges from an attack by German aircraft during one of the longest bomber escort missions of World War II. The 99th even set an Air Corps record for shooting down 5 German planes in less than 4 minutes, and the first jet planes used in the war. Military service during World War II and racial integration in the armed forces heightened expectations for social progress in general society. Black men and women returned from the conflict with more than a sense of entitlement to the benefits of first-class citizenship, but in many cases, a new determination to lead their communities in the quest for civil and equal rights. An African-American Army corporal returning from the war in 1945 best described how many black veterans felt when they remarked, and I quote, "I spent 4 years in the Army to free a bunch of Frenchmen and Dutchmen, and I'm hanged if I'm going to let the Alabama version of the German kick me around when I get back home. No, sirree, Bob. I went into the Army, the N-word. I'm coming out a man." And let me just stop or slow down for a second and just say this. This attitude that's demonstrated by this Army corporal after World War II was fairly common. You see veterans making these type of statements and remarks up north. You see them doing it down south. And of course, just like after World War I, there was a lot of racial conflict and confrontations during this particular period of time. One of the more famous ones, and of course that I believe, and many historians believe is closely connected to the desegregation of the military, was when Isaac Woodward was blinded and his eyes were gouged out after confronting a local sheriff in South Carolina because he was riding on the bus and there was a dispute about him being disruptive. The point is that these types of conflicts happened were very common at this particular time. One of the things that I did notice many years ago when I was at the National Archives doing research on this particular topic in my book, I noticed that there was many cases of African Americans who were refusing to move to the back of the bus during this particular period while they were in uniform. And what's even more surprising, I think, or maybe not, is that many African-American women got into confrontations with bus drivers and also local law enforcement because they were in military uniform, and when they were asked to move to the back of the bus, they refused. And it was very common at that time for those individuals to point out that they were serving their country, they were wearing the uniform, and they did not appreciate being treated the way they were. And so you see this type of response happening throughout the United States. And it's being done by many individuals who are wearing the military uniform. Combat veterans emerged from the war with a lessened sense of hopelessness, with an enhanced sense of assertiveness and resilience. After the war, many of these combat veterans were more capable, more active, and more in control of their lives. The long-standing connection between military service and training and black manhood that can be traced from the 17th century continued to resonate among African Americans in the 1950s as they served the nation in the armed forces and returned to civilian society eager to claim citizenship rights and seek new social opportunities. Soldiers for democracy. So after the war, African-American World War II veterans resisted. And am I on the right slide? Yes. They resisted racism and discrimination in hope of claiming self-respect, dignity, and assert the manly qualities of courage, strength, and fortitude. For instance, World War II veteran Amazi Moore, who, upon returning to Mississippi after the war, led voter registration drives in Mississippi. In South Carolina, William Saunders, a Korean War veteran, became a well-known community activist and one of the chief organizers in 1969 hospital strike in Charleston, South Carolina. And as I mentioned, I lived in Charleston for quite a while. I taught and was a dean at the Citadel Military College, and I had the pleasure of meeting Bill Saunders and speaking with him, who even at that time was still involved in local politics and the civil rights movement. Georgia native Hoseas Williams served in Patton's Third Army during World War II. And in 1965, he was appointed by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to organize the now famous Selma to Montgomery March in Alabama. World War II veteran Walter Green returned to Detroit, Michigan, after the war, filled with an energy and passion to fight for social equality after fighting for his life in the Pacific and against racism and discrimination in his unit. Green remarked, and I quote, "The Negro soldier is going to be militant because he is looking for something. He expects something better than the status quo when he gets home, or the public will have a severe problem on its hands," end quote. Two of the more noteworthy local civil rights leaders were former Marine Robert F. Williams from Monroe County, North Carolina, and Earnest Chilly Willie Thomas from Bogalusa, Louisiana, who served in the Air Force as a radio operator during the Korean War. Robert F. Williams not only became the leader of the local NAACP branch in Monroe County, he encouraged other military veterans to become active members and resist pressure from the white community. In one case in late 1957, after an African-American physician and his family received death threats, Williams and his fellow war veterans organized the community into listening posts to alert them when a heavily armed Ku Klux Klan motorcade was approaching. In preparation, the men dug foxholes, stacked sandbags, and met the onslaught with automatic weapons, shotguns, and German-made rifles. Once the hooded terrorists began to fire their weapons, they encountered a steady barrage of bullets from several vantage points. From that day on in Monroe County, the Ku Klux Klan was afraid to enter black neighborhoods for fear of reprisals. In Bogalusa, Louisiana, the local police force was composed of white officers and a small contingent of African Americans. In 1964, the police chief decided to fire all the black policemen at the request of the white community leaders. Earnest Thomas, with the aid of other black war veterans, established an armed self-defense organization called the Deacons for Defense and Justice. The Deacons for Defense and Justice became so popular that chapters were started in Texas and Arkansas, and plans to organize chapters in Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina. The Deacons for Defense became a major deterrent to white terrorism in the South and Klan activity in the black community. Chapters also provided security and protection for local civil rights leaders and marchers. During the Meredith March Against Fear in Mississippi in 1966, the Deacons for Defense protected Meredith and gained national attention. Very similar to the Reconstruction era and the decade after World War I, when Black America's most militant and tenacious African-American leaders were former soldiers and officers who challenged white supremacy and terrorism in the South. Thousands of black veterans of World War II and the Korean War led local and state civil rights struggles throughout the South and became staunch supporters of armed resistance and self-defense activism. And I want to just sort of add to this particular slide at the conclusion of my presentation. So one of the things I learned as I was doing research and I'm looking closer not only into the civil rights movement, but also leadership on a national and also local level, is that I found that there were many local civil rights leaders who were all veterans, whether it was World War II or Korea. For instance, Medgar Evers in Mississippi, and he, of course, was the leader of the Mississippi NAACP and was assassinated. He was a World War II Army veteran. You have James Meredith, who I just mentioned, who was also involved in the civil rights movement in Mississippi. He was an Air Force veteran and served in the Korean War. You have James Former, who was a Korean War Air Force veteran, and James Foreman was a member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as the Black Panther Party. And you also have Wesley Wallace Law, who was the NAACP chair or president in Savannah, Georgia, during the 1950s, and he was also a World War II Army veteran. And so this legacy of military service and the connection between citizenship rights and the civil rights movement is something that can easily be traced throughout not only American history, but also the history of the West. As I mentioned earlier about many of the foundation to this connection comes from the ancient Greeks and Romans. You also see this type of leadership and activism from African Americans after World War I. You see it after the Civil War, where I mentioned earlier that many civil war officers and soldiers went on to not only be very involved in politics in their local communities, but also many of them became founders of historically Black colleges and universities, seeing that education was also an opportunity to fight for one's civil rights. You also see this from the colonial period. Many of the French soldiers that supported the American Revolution and the colonies fight against the British, many of those individuals after the Revolutionary War, those individuals went back to France and they led the French Revolution in that country. And so there's a long and strong connection to military service, citizenship, but also definitions of manhood and educational opportunity. And I'll end with this sort of last statement. Unfortunately, on January 6th, we all witnessed the insurrection that happened at the U.S. Capitol. When I learned that many of the insurrectionists and individuals who attacked the Capitol were either former military or individuals who served in some capacity, but they were all screaming that their rights had been infringed upon, and they felt it was their duty to do this act, whether real or imagined. So again, even to this day, as we live in the United States and we're at somewhat of a difficult time politically, you still see that the connection between military service and also citizenship and definitions of citizenship still resonates and is very strong today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marcus. So we do have a few questions. One of the questions that have come through is: were other minority groups other minorities grouped together with Black units during World War II?
That's a great question. The answer is generally no. You find that Native Americans, they were able to fight with white units. Of course, you have Japanese American soldiers who fought in segregated units also. So normally African American units were primarily comprised of African Americans or people of African descent.
Excellent. And a question about the GI Bill. So were Black soldiers who were served in World War II, what was the GI Bill for them? Was it the same as white soldiers during the war?
Right. Yes and no. And like I always tell my daughters, and they always say, "What do you mean?" African Americans, no doubt, they were able to benefit from the GI Bill. I look at my grandfather. I look at, I remember years and years ago, I was interviewing my barber, who was an elderly gentleman. And I asked him about military service and the GI Bill, and he literally told me, he said, look, when I came out of the military, I was able to go to barber school and learn how to be a barber, and eventually he ended up owning something like 6 barbershops throughout the city. So you have African Americans who are able to benefit. Plus, I will say this, through my research of historically black colleges, you find that the enrollment at black colleges in the 1950s and early 60s skyrocketed because many African Americans were using the GI Bill to go to college. Now, certainly, I think where you probably have sort of the biggest discrepancy between white veterans and black veterans is African Americans being able to use the GI Bill to purchase homes and those sort of things. Because at that time, there was redlining, and also there wasn't an effort to sort of make sure that African Americans had opportunities for housing and those sort of things. But certainly African Americans were able to I've often even argued that the GI Bill is really responsible for building the black middle class in the 1950s. And so for the most part, they were able to really benefit from the GI Bill and also their families.
Another question that came in is, did Eleanor positively influence FDR's position on African Americans in the military?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've done a lot of research, not necessarily on Eleanor Roosevelt, but certainly World War II, and that's one of the things that I often come across is when African American leaders are reaching out to the president and they're advocating for certain things. There's always a reference to Eleanor Roosevelt and her voice, so to speak, or connection with the president. And in many cases, I've also read that African-American leaders who are having difficulty getting in connection or contacting the president would go through Eleanor Roosevelt to sort of get a meeting or to get a point across. I don't think that it was anything sort of official, but I think her advocacy and her support was certainly appreciated, but also used from time to time.
Excellent. Another question, it's when was the 10.6% service cap established by the 1925 study eliminated?
That's interesting. I'm vaguely familiar with it, but I know by the mid-1940s, when manpower demands became more and more important. There was I guess a move to sort of get rid of the quota system for African Americans. But I'll be honest with you, I don't know if it was something that was legislated, meaning that someone came out and said, we're not going to do this, or it was just ignored, where the military was inducting and bringing in more than the 10%.
Excellent. And if people wanted to learn more, because I know I definitely learned a lot today through your presentation, but if people wanted to learn more about African American service during World War II, do you have some different books and resources that folks could do some research on their own?
Yeah, well, of course, there's a shamelessly plug for my book that's on the screen right now, and I cover a lot of that information. But one of the things I did do, because I was having difficulty finding copyrighted photos, I decided to use book covers of some of the sources that I used and read in preparation for this presentation. So the book by Christopher Parker on Black veterans, I don't know if you guys can still see this screen. This book by Lance Hill about the Deacons for Defense is a very important book and talks about the Deacons of Defense and their contributions to the civil rights movement. This is one of my favorite books. Timothy Tyson is an extraordinary writer. He doesn't even write like a historian. He writes like a writer. This book was really very influential on me, and I learned an awful lot because many people would argue that Robert F. Williams also became sort of the modern father of the Black Power movement. Many of the Black Power leaders in the 1960s were somewhat, whether you would say followers or supporters of Robert F. Williams. And so this was a really great book. And then this book here by Christopher Parker, Fighting for Democracy. And it talks a lot about Black veterans coming back from the war and being involved in local politics and in their communities.
Excellent. Well, I think that is all the questions that we have from our audience today, but I want to thank you so much, Marcus, for presenting this. I can't thank you enough for joining us today. And for all of those who are joining us online, thank you for tuning in today. And also to our sponsors, ARP Louisiana. We hope that you will join us again very soon at the National World War II Museum. For our upcoming list of events, please check out www.national.ww2museum.org. Thank you so much, and you all have a wonderful day.